Welcome to Trash Talk MMA.
Smile on my face, behind my back, they talk trash.
The #1 podcast for news and insight that matters in the world of mixed martial arts. Brought to you live and unfiltered from all four corners of the globe by MMA aficionado Antoine Pelche.
Yo, and welcome to the Trash Talk MMA podcast. I'm your host, Antoine Pelche, and I'm fired up today. If you've been listening to my previous shows, there was some different intros. I got these big, fat new ones now. The music was produced by my good buddy, Billy Slade, and the whole thing was finally produced by Music Radio Creative. So I love the sound. I think it really sets the tone for what I want this show to be, and I'm kind of considering this the 2.0 launch of the website and the podcast. And I'm also fired up because we have a huge weekend of live MMA events coming up, starting on Friday with Invicta FC 11 and Bellator 134. I'm going to do previews of those events right now, and tomorrow I'll be coming to you with a preview of obviously the Ronda Rousey versus Kat Zingano fight at UFC 184. So let's kick things off with Invicta FC 11, Cyborg versus Tweet. If any of my listeners are unfamiliar with Invicta, it's basically the best and biggest all-female fight promotion in the world. You can catch all of the Invicta FC cards on UFC Fight Pass. If you don't know what UFC Fight Pass is, that is the UFC's digital subscription service. It's like a digital channel where they provide a ton of exclusive events, a whole bunch of international events that you can't find on TV, can't find on pay-per-view. And Invicta is one of the latest promotions to actually the first promotion that is currently running, and that runs its shows directly through UFC Fight Pass as well. I think it's like $10 a month. I love it. It gives you a huge library of past events, past fights, tons of exclusive content, especially for somebody like myself that's been traveling all over the world for the past year and a half. Fight Pass has been a godsend for me to follow all the events live, especially with the time differences and whatnot. So if you've never checked out Invicta, make sure you do this weekend, because there's going to be a big title fight, a featherweight title fight between Christiane Cyborg Justino and Charmaine Tweet. If you don't know who Cyborg is, you've probably been sleeping under a rock. She is the arch nemesis of UFC bantamweight champion Ronda Rousey, who's fighting tomorrow. These two have been going back and forth at each other with barbs for literally, it seems like, years. Cyborg is the woman who, along with Gino Carano, basically put the female fighters on the map back in the day. And she's a huge component of this sport. She's 12-1 with only one no contest. The only fight she ever lost was by submission in her debut, and she's a wrecking machine. So Cyborg is fighting against the Canadian Charmaine Tweet this weekend. Tweet is basically looking like she's being set up to lose here. She's 6-4 with 5 wins by submission. The fact that she's won by submission is good because Cyborg's only loss was in her first professional fight, as I mentioned, and to a submission. Problem there, though, is that that fight was back in 2005, and Cyborg is a completely different fighter, fully undefeated since then. There's been some, she did fail a steroid drug test when she was the Strikeforce champion, and she was stripped of her title because of that. Ronda Rousey has continued to blast Cyborg in the media, claiming that she's still on roids. Anyway, she did have to pass a PED out of competition test to be licensed to fight tomorrow in Invicta. She did pass those tests with flying colors, so this fight is cleared for takeoff, and I'm predicting that Cyborg is going to run through Charmaine Tweet pretty violently. Ronda Rousey's actually been pretty vocal about this fight as well, kind of clowning Cyborg, saying this fight is a huge step down for her. Ronda actually fought and defeated Charmaine Tweet in what was, I believe, Ronda's second fight and what was Charmaine Tweet's first fight, and submitted her in with a first round armbar back in 2011. So it doesn't seem like Charmaine Tweet has really the credentials and the past wins and fights to pose any threat to Cyborg. So like I said, I'm expecting Cyborg to run through her. And even though I'm Canadian, like Tweet is, I'll be rooting for Cyborg in this one. I want Cyborg to win. I want her to defend her belt. I'd like to see her then drop to bantamweight in Invicta, get a solid fight against a solid opponent there, and then hopefully make the transition to the UFC and fight Ronda Rousey if Ronda Rousey is still the champion after beating Kat Zingano tomorrow. Even if she's not the champion, I still think it's a huge grudge match of the likes of the Cyborg versus Gina Carano fight years ago that really put female MMA on the map. And everybody knows that Ronda Rousey has to fight Cyborg. This is the Mayweather versus Pacquiao of female fights. And it's one of these great fights that people have been clamoring to see for years, and that's never happened. And hopefully it doesn't go the route of huge potential fights that never happened, such as Mirko Cro Cop versus Couture that got flushed down the toilet when Cro Cop got head kick knocked out by Gabriel Gonzaga, or the Fedor versus Brock Lesnar fight that everybody wanted to see in the UFC that never happened because the UFC couldn't come to terms with Fedor and his management team to get him to fight in the UFC. Or even, Wanderlei Silva versus Chuck Liddell in their primes when they were both the respective light heavyweight champions of the UFC and Pride. Way back in around 2005 when those guys were just whooping everybody's asses. I really want to see Cyborg versus Ronda Rousey. I know the whole rest of anybody who's interested in female MMA and MMA in general wants to see that fight because Cyborg has the tools to pose a real compelling threat to Ronda Rousey. And, is really the only logical matchup for Ronda after we see what happens versus Kat Zingano tomorrow. Nothing on the rest of the Invicta FC 11 card really stands out as being a relevant fight, in women's MMA. So, it's obviously a very top-heavy card. But, give these ladies a chance. I've watched a few Invicta FC events. I am guilty of not having watched them all. But they always put on great fights. They're really, they really work tightly with the UFC. There's a lot of co-promotion going on between those two promotions. And the UFC is very supportive of it. So if you want to see some of the up-and-coming ladies in MMA that will likely make the transition to the strawweight and bantamweight female divisions in the UFC, make sure you follow Invicta FC. It's a great promotion, and it's on Fight Pass now. So like I said, for $10 a month, you get tons of great events, and you also get this brand new promotion, or at least a brand new promotion to UFC Fight Pass in Invicta. So moving on from Invicta FC 11, let's dig into Bellator 134, which is dubbed the British Invasion. Now, originally when this card was announced, it was supposed to be loaded, at least on the main card, with at least one British fighter in every single one of the 5 fights. Due to injury problems, this card has taken a big hit. It's unofficially Scott Coker's second tentpole event after the Tito Ortiz and Bonner card. And it's no longer really a British heavy card, and it's no longer really a tentpole event because of some very important fights that have fallen apart due to injury. For starters, there was going to be James Thompson versus Bobby Lashley too. Again, not a really relevant fight, but obviously a fight that's going to put a lot of asses in seats and attract viewers by the presence of Bobby Lashley, who, if you don't know who he is, he's a current pro wrestler, as well as an MMA fighter, the likes of Brock Lesnar, and he was going to fight James the Colossus Thompson, in a rematch that surprisingly Thompson won the first time out. Thompson was injured, and this fight has now been replaced by a heavyweight contest between former UFC fighter Chet Congo and Mohamed King Mo Lawal, who is stepping up from light heavyweight to fight Congo at heavyweight. In the co-main event, there was supposed to be a great welterweight title fight between defending Bellator welterweight champion Douglas Lima and Paul Semtex Daly. Anybody who watches MMA knows Daly, known for incredible knockout power in both hands. They were supposed to fight for the welterweight title, and now that fight is off due to an injury to Lima. So Lima was replaced by the little-known yet highly experienced Andre Santos. So at least Daly's still on the card, but it definitely takes a lot of luster and shine off of the original matchup. There's also a fight between former Pride and UFC standout Sokaju versus the little-known English fighter Linton Vassell. And unfortunately, the exciting fight I was really looking forward to at welterweight was the Brit Michael Page versus Curtis Millender. Curtis Millender, not very well known. Unfortunately, Michael Page is now out with a gruesome cut injury, and he's been replaced by Brennan Ward, so that fight really doesn't hold my interest anymore at all. There's also an interesting preliminary fight involving former UFC welterweight Tamden McCrory, who had an explosive Bellator debut a couple months ago I'm not really sure now with all these injuries and these shakeups of the main card why Tamden McCrory's bout hasn't been promoted to the main card. In any case, it's one that you're going to want to watch on the prelims on Spike.com. Then, of course, the main event on this Bellator 134 card is a light heavyweight title fight between reigning and defending champ Emmanuel Newton and challenger Liam McGeary, who was the winner of the Bellator Summer Series light heavyweight tournament last year. So working our way up from the prelims, let's take a look at the first fight, which is going to be a middleweight contest between Tamden McCrory and Jason Butcher. Tamden McCrory is a really interesting fighter. He's, again, one of those long, lean builds that have been, trademarked or characterized by a lot of champions in the sport right now, whether it's, former champion Anderson Silva, John Jones, long and lean and rangy, Jose Aldo as well. Of course, guys like Dominic Cruz. A lot of those guys have that build, and Tamden McCrory is one of the guys who knows how to use that excellently. He lost to John Howard in the UFC way back at UFC 101 in August of 2009. And what's incredible is he's been out for basically 5 years. But he came back in September of last year with a fight at Bellator 123 and put on an absolute murder fest versus Brennan Ward, knocking him out super flushly in 20 seconds. So it was great to see Tamden back in action. He's up from welterweight to middleweight, and I expect him to make a lot of big waves in Bellator, and it's really a shame that his fight's being buried on the prelims. I'm not familiar with his opponent, Jason Butcher. Looking at his record, he's 8-1 with 3 wins by knockout and 5 wins by submission. He's coming off a win in his latest fight back in October against Andreas Michailidis, where Butcher won by TKO. Hard to say who's going to take this one. I hope Tamden McCrory wins. I remember him having a great personality and some great, interesting, unique wins and performances back in the UFC. I think if he's taken off, 5 years to rest up and get back in shape, he can be a force at welterweight. And I'd like to see Tamden McCrory get the win. But basically, if I don't have any intelligent insight on Jason Butcher since I've never seen him fight and can only look at his record. So hopefully it'll be a compelling fight, one that'll last more than 20 seconds, so we can really see, what sort of shape and other tools Tamden McCrory has developed in the 5 years since he's been out of the UFC. Hopefully he's not underestimating Jason Butcher either, because Jason Butcher has had 6 fights in Bellator. He's 5-1, and his 5 wins all come via stoppage. So the guy apparently has a lot of tools. He beat a good fighter in Jiva Santana. If you've never seen him, he used to be known as the Arm Collector. He was this guy who just kept winning multiple fights in a row with arm bars, which gave him that nickname. I really like Jiva Santana. I believe he actually retired after his loss to Jason Butcher. So let's see. I mean, hopefully he'll push Tamden McCrory into some deep waters, and we'll see what both guys has in the gas tank and what they're going to bring to the table. Moving on to the main card, I'd like to take a look at the light heavyweight fight between Sokaju and Linton Vassell. Anyone who's a fan of MMA, and especially a fan of Pride, is familiar with Sokaju. He really made a huge name for himself when he came into Pride at Pride 33, one of the greatest MMA events of all time, in my opinion, and he knocked out cold Antonio Rogério Nogueira, a.k.a. Little Nog. The Nogueira brothers are notorious for having amazing chins, and for a relatively unknown fighter such as Sokaju to step into Pride, one of the probably the biggest stage of MMA at that time, and get that win was absolutely stunning, especially since it happened in 23 seconds. After that victory against Little Nog, Sokaju put on yet again an amazing performance, knocking out the also extremely durable Ricardo Arona in Pride 34 at just the next event after Pride 33. In just under 2 minutes. So off of those 2 performances alone, Sokaju became an overnight sensation in mixed martial arts, and from there he transitioned to the UFC. Unfortunately for Sokaju, it all went downhill from there. In his UFC debut, he suffered a submission loss to Lyoto Machida. He bounced back after that to defeat Kazuhiro Nakamura, who's really a natural middleweight, by TKO. And then after that, Sokaju just kept taking losses to important fighters like Luis Kane, Hanato Sobral, Gegard Mousasi, and even Ikuhisa Minowa, who knocked him out at Dynamite 2009. So it's just been Sokaju has been pretty much a bust. He He came in with I was expecting him to come into the UFC and really do some damage. Ultimately, he got exposed by a lot of better fighters than him, and he really hasn't been able to recover and put on any sort of, impressive performance streak since those 2 wins in Pride. That being said, he did join Bellator at Bellator 121 in June of 2014, where he defeated the little-known Terry Davany by submission. And following that, in October of last year at Bellator 127, he earned a TKO via elbow strikes victory over Malik Merad, again, an unknown fighter. But at least Sokaju has a 2-fight win streak. He's back in a known promotion, and when he's on, he's a great fighter, and he's got a cool look. I think he represents that look of Pride fighters back in the day, where these guys looked like they came out of comic books, and very, very unique, with his dreadlocks and his predator mask. So I'd love to see Sokaju come in here and get a win against Linton Vassell, but Linton Vassell's no joke either. Vassell, fighting out of Britain, has 19 matches. He's got 14 wins, 4 losses, 1 no contest, 5 wins by knockout, 7 by submission. So the guy is a stoppage machine. In his last fight back at Bellator 130 in October of last year, he suffered an unfortunate loss to reigning UFC light heavyweight champion Emmanuel Newton by submission. But prior to that, he was actually on a 9-fight win streak, loaded with a bunch of submission and TKO stoppages. So, Vassell has a lot of tools, and a lot more than it would appear that Sokaju has. And, if his only loss is to the reigning champion, Emmanuel Newton, there's no shame in that. Newton has been a wrecking ball. We're going to cover his record when we get to his fight at the top of this Bellator 134 preview that I'm doing. But my money at this point would be on Vassell coming in and wiping the floor with Sokaju, unless Sokaju can land a stiff punch and rock him and drop him early. Next up on the card is a heavyweight contest between former UFC heavyweight contender Czech Congo and King Mo Lawal, who normally fights at light heavyweight. So, like I said at the top of this podcast, this fight is basically replacing the James Thompson versus Bobby Lashley fight that got canceled due to injury to Thompson. So I don't like Czech Congo. I think that, every single one of his fights, there's always eye pokes, groin shots. There's always some sort of controversy, and his fights are always messy and ugly. He's the type of guy who can always beat, C and B minus fighters, but anytime he gets a step up in competition, he shows up acting like he's the shit, and basically he gets tooled every time, whether it was by, Frank Mir or Roy Nelson or, any number of, much better UFC fighters. So I think, when Czech Congo came in, I thought he really looked the part, and he had the tools necessary to be a force. And really, he's never really stepped up his game. He's got decent striking, but he really doesn't know how to pour it on. I do have a soft spot in my heart for Czech Congo, though, for one performance, and that was his absolutely incredible comeback when he was getting battered to death by Pat Barry. That's probably the greatest comeback in the history of the sport. I love that fight, but it's not enough for me to want Czech Congo to win this fight. King Mo is coming up from light heavyweight. I like King Mo. He's kind of, King Mo, it'd be great to see him find that killer instinct that we've seen him display at times, but that, of late hasn't really been his MO. I think King Mo has the ability to pour it on and destroy guys, and when he does, it's very impressive. Unfortunately, it's always against substandard competition. He does have a great victory over Gegard Mousasi, but still, that's not enough. I think King Mo really still needs to come into himself in a major league such as Bellator, and this is going to give him an opportunity to really make a statement. Moving up to heavyweight, I believe he has fought at heavyweight before earlier on in his career, but he's really established himself as a light heavyweight. Props to him for taking this fight on short notice against Czech Congo. Props to him for stepping up in weight, and hopefully he'll come in there with his mojo right, find his groove, and get a stoppage win over Czech Congo. I'd like to see that happen. Both men are currently riding 2-fight win streaks, but again, they're not against notable competition. So this is going to be a chance for both men to try to put on a great show and get a win over another notable fighter and push their win streaks to 3-0, or for one person to have his 2-0 streak broken. Look for Czech Congo to keep this fight standing, or perhaps take it into the clinch, land some knees, land some hard shots on the outside. I'd say look for King Mo to be throwing some big overhands on the feet, or either trying to clinch this thing up, get Congo to the ground, pound him out there, or land a submission on him. Next up on the main card is a welterweight matchup between Paul Daly and Andre Santos. Both of these men are very, very experienced veterans. Paul Daly has fought 50 professional fights, and he has 35 wins and 13 losses, with 26 of those wins coming by knockout. So it's pretty evident, what it is that Paul Daly brings to the table, and I think that's why he gets booked by so many different promotions, because he's a knockout machine. He just loves smashing people, and he never has any other goal but to go out there and to end the fight as quickly and as violently as possible. I think that's what makes him one of people's favorite fighters, and it's one of the reasons why everybody wants to see him back in the UFC. We're not sure if that's ever going to happen again, because if you remember correctly, in 2010, in his last fight in the UFC, he fought Josh Koscheck, and like a complete idiot, punched him after the bell, and Dana White has vowed to never allow Daly to fight again in the UFC. We know that Dana White doesn't always hold his word, and that anything is possible. I think if Daly becomes an impressive fighter in Bellator, there's a very high chance that we could see him back in the UFC, and I personally would like to see that happen. His opponent, Andre Santos, has 46 matches, 37 wins, 9 losses. Of note, he's got 22 submission wins. So this is great, because Daly's going to be looking for the KO. Andre Santos is going to be looking for the submission. It'll be interesting to see who can impose his will on the other. My money is always going to be on Paul Daly, unless he's fighting somebody that's higher ranked than him in the UFC. I love Daly. He's the type of fighter I love to watch. He goes in there, he's got the killer instinct. He's got the tools to win and explode any welterweight on the planet at any given time. He's cocky. He's confident. He talks smack. Bring it, man. I want to see Daly get a very impressive win, and I want to see Douglas Lima get healthy, and that fight has to go down, because Douglas Lima is an absolutely awesome fighter as well, and that would be just incredible fireworks to have the original fight that was planned for this card of Paul Daly versus Douglas Lima. So Daly, put it on him. Let's get that fight done, and let's move on to that title fight versus Lima. Finally, in the co-main event of the night, there's a light heavyweight title fight between reigning champion Emmanuel Newton and challenger Liam McGeary. So, Emmanuel Newton has been on a tear in Bellator. He, since losing in July 2012 to Attila Vey at Bellator 72, he's gone on an absolute killing spree. He's 7-0. He's got 2 victories over King Mo Lawal, a great win over Mikhail Zayats, Attila Vey, a spinning back fist KO of Joey Beltran, and as mentioned before, a submission win over Linton Vassell. He's definitely looking and fighting like a champion. Very, very difficult to bet against him. A few short years ago, I remember watching Newton fighting in the MFC, and he was definitely pegged as a decision fighter, and it's great to see that he's added a lot of tools to his toolbox, in particular these spinning back fist KOs. If you haven't seen the one that he landed against King Mo, that one was fantastic, and the one that he just landed a couple fights ago against Joey Beltran was absolutely horrifying. It sounded like a sledgehammer hitting a slab of meat. So go check out those two highlight reels of Emmanuel Newton landing some spinning back fist knockouts. It's just a thing of beauty. Even though Newton's been looking so dominant, this is truly going to be an interesting fight versus Liam McGeary, because Liam McGeary has some physical tools that are going to be very difficult to overcome. He's 6'6", he's gigantic, and he has an 81-inch reach. So, physically, he's going to provide a threat that Emmanuel Newton's never faced in his career. Furthermore, McGeary is unbeaten. He's had 9 fights, 9 wins, 5 by knockout, 4 by submission. So he's tall, he's rangy, he's undefeated, and he's versatile. As far as a prediction on this one, this is hard to say. I think you can't really bet against Newton. He hasn't shown any flaws as a champion, and he's fought better competition than McGeary. But McGeary's got a ton of momentum around him. Like I said, he's got a ton of physical gifts that should allow him to be able to impose his will on Newton, but I don't really see that happening. Right now, if I had to put money down, I would put it on Newton. He's the champ. He's undefeated as such. I think he's going to have what it takes to find a chink in McGeary and put a stop to his undefeated record. That being said, McGeary's shown some incredible tools in his fight, an incredible diversity in his array of attack. And to see him get a win over Newton is absolutely probable and wouldn't be surprising. So there you have it. That's my Invicta FC 11 and my Bellator 134 preview. This Bellator 134 card has been somewhat decimated by injuries. It's a real shame. The original lineup was going to really provide fireworks, really provide some interesting matchups and a lot of star power. That star power has faded. Those interesting matchups have been replaced by, less compelling ones. I'm going to be tuning in anyways. There's a lot of fighters on there that I like. I want to see what goes down, especially in that main event. I want to see Paul Daly fight, and I want to see Tamden McCrory. So check out these fights. Check out the website, trashtalkmma.com. Hit me up on Twitter. Look forward to hearing your comments. I look forward to seeing which matchups you're looking forward to at these two cards and who your predictions are. Peace.
Thanks for listening to the Trash Talk MMA podcast. Be sure to visit trashtalkmma.com.
Smile on my face, behind my back, and talk trash.
And don't forget to follow Antoine on Twitter at Trash Talk MMA. Let us know you're listening. Use hashtag Trash Talk MMA.
She's a huge component of this sport. She's 12-1 with only one no contest. The only fight she ever lost was by submission in her debut, and she's a wrecking machine. So Cyborg is fighting against the Canadian Charmaine Tweet this weekend. Tweet is basically looking like she's being set up to lose here. She's 6-4 with 5 wins by submission. The fact that she's won by submission is good because Cyborg's only loss was in her first professional fight, as I mentioned, and to a submission. Problem there, though, is that that fight was back in 2005, and Cyborg is a completely different fighter, fully undefeated since then. There's been some, she did fail a steroid drug test when she was the Strikeforce champion, and she was stripped of her title because of that. Ronda Rousey has continued to blast Cyborg in the media, claiming that she's still on roids. Anyway, she did have to pass a PED out of competition test to be licensed. It shows directly through UFC Fight Pass as well. I think it's like $10 a month. I love it. It gives you a huge library of past events, past fights, tons of exclusive content, especially for somebody like myself that's been traveling all over the world for the past year and a half. Fight Pass has been a godsend for me to follow all the events live, especially with the time differences and whatnot. So if you've never checked out Invicta, make sure you do this weekend because there's going to be a big title fight, a featherweight title fight between Christiane Cyborg Justino and Charmaine Tweet. If you don't know who Cyborg is, you've probably been sleeping under a rock. She is the arch nemesis of UFC bantamweight champion Ronda Rousey, who's fighting tomorrow. These two have been going back and forth at each other with barbs for literally, it seems like, years. Cyborg is the woman who, along with Gino Carano, basically put the female fighters on the map back in the day. And I'm also fired up because we have a huge weekend of live MMA events coming up, starting on Friday with Invicta FC 11 and Bellator 134. I'm going to do previews of those events right now. And tomorrow I'll be coming to you with a preview of obviously the Ronda Rousey versus Kat Zingano fight at UFC 184. So let's kick things off with Invicta FC 11, Cyborg versus Tweet. If any of my listeners are unfamiliar with Invicta, it's basically the best and biggest all-female fight promotion in the world. You can catch all of the Invicta FC cards on UFC Fight Pass. If you don't know what UFC Fight Pass is, that is the UFC's digital subscription service. It's like a digital channel where they provide a ton of exclusive events, a whole bunch of international events that you can't find on TV, can't find on pay-per-view. And Invicta is one of the latest promotions actually the first promotion that is currently running and that runs.
Welcome to Trash Talk MMA.
Smile on my face, behind my back, and talk trash.
The #1 podcast for news and insight that matters in the world of mixed martial arts. Brought to you live and unfiltered from all 4 corners of the globe by MMA aficionado Antoine Peltier.
Yo, and welcome to the Trash Talk MMA podcast. I'm your host, Antoine Peltier, and I'm fired up today. If you've been listening to my previous shows, there was some different intros. I got these big fat new ones now. The music was produced by my good buddy Billy Slade, and the whole thing was finally produced by Music Radio Creative. So I love the sound. I think it really sets the tone for what I want this show to be, and I'm kind of considering this the 2.0 launch of the website and the podcast. And I'm licensed to fight tomorrow in Invicta. She did pass those tests with flying colors, so this fight is cleared for takeoff, and I'm predicting that Cyborg is going to run through Charmaine Tweet pretty violently. Ronda Rousey's actually been pretty vocal about this fight as well, kind of clowning Cyborg, saying this fight is a huge step down for her. Ronda actually fought and defeated Charmaine Tweet in what was, I believe, Ronda's second fight and what was Charmaine Tweet's first fight, and submitted her in with a first round armbar back in 2011. So it doesn't seem like Charmaine Tweet has really the credentials and the past wins and fights to pose any threat to Cyborg. So like I said, I'm expecting Cyborg to run through her. And even though I'm Canadian, like Tweet is, I'll be rooting for Cyborg in this one. I want Cyborg to win. I want her to defend her belt. I'd like to see her then drop to bantamweight in Invicta, get a solid fight against a solid opponent there, and then hopefully make the transition to the UFC.